10 out of 10 personal finance experts will tell you to max out your 401k. But if you actually, when I run the numbers, I'm like, I'm not sure that's the best decision for everybody. So,
all right, let's maybe just start with like your perspective on personal finance and on financial markets. I think what's very interesting about you is that you take a data-driven approach. And there's a whole bunch of things that most people, I would say, hold as truth or hold as these like religious almost perspectives on financial markets. And you've been able to time and again either disprove or kind of shed further light on why maybe it's not completely the only way to think about it. And so what is your process? Like, do you find things people say and then go look at the data? Do you start with the data and then come to conclusions and then compare them? Like, what's that process look like?
Honestly, it's a little bit of both. Sometimes I'm like, you know what, why don't we actually check this? Is this actually true? For example, one of the big points out there is like, oh, you should max out your 401k. And so I'm like, okay, well, let's see, like, how much of actual benefit do you get from maxing, from going like above the match, right? And then I see like, oh, you're getting like 70 bips a year, 0.7%. Most 401k plans are something like 50 bips in fees. So really, after like the all-in fees, you're getting 20 bips a year to lock up your capital till you're 60. And I'm like, is that really worth it? Like 20 bips, is that worth it? And so like, once you start to question just like a lot of the things that it's kind of like the Elon Musk type of idea going back to first principles. Like, I love that idea because it's like, we've been told so many things, like basically, I would say 10 out of 10 personal finance experts will tell you to max out your 401k. But if you actually, when I run the numbers, I'm like, I'm not sure that's the best decision for everybody. So it's just kind of going back to first principles and saying like, what's actually true, what's not true, right? Versus what the media tells us, right?
So go back to this for a second, because I think this first, let's just start off real hot. This violates every single thing anyone's ever been told by a financial advisor, which is they do get the advice, max out all of your retirement. And your argument from the data is that there's only a 0.7% advantage every year from doing that. Explain what that means. Like, where do you get the 0.7% a year from?
So that particular analysis, I'm comparing a Roth 401k to just like having that money in a brokerage account and just managing it well. Like, you're not buying in and out all the time. You're just like buying and hold over a long period. And so you're basically avoiding capital gains. That's the one thing. If that 15% capital gains compounded over a lifetime, that's going to end up being like 0.7% a year annualized, right? That's the difference we're getting. Now, technically you're like, well, what if I use a traditional or a versus Roth? It gets a little bit more convoluted there, but like, no matter what, you're going to have to pay income tax. We know that. Like, at some point, you either pay it at the beginning with the Roth or you pay it later with a traditional, right? When you're in retirement. So assuming those rates are the same, they won't be necessarily depending on a lot of factors, but let's assume those are the same. The only thing I care about is the capital gains tax, which is the second tax, which is what you avoid by having a 401k versus having it in like a brokerage account, a taxable account. So I'm just like looking at that difference and I'm saying like, how big is that? Like, I put the same amount of money in every year and did that for like 30 or 40 years. And I said, look at the end, like, how much more money do I have? And like that difference. And that difference is about like 0.7% compounded, all else equal. But that's assuming no difference in fees. It's assuming the same funds. Everything is assumed to be the same. But once you actually look, like, the 401ks have fees and you have to like, you don't get to choose your investments. There's like already only a certain set of options you have, right? So when you take all that into account, like, it's the benefits even smaller in some cases. And some people have to pay 1% a year in their 401k, right? It's like, if you're paying over 70 bips in your funds, you're actually getting negative alpha for everything above the match, right? Like, think about that. Like, it's just not doable. So it doesn't make sense to me.
So when you think about that, you find this data point, right? And you're like, hey, maybe this isn't exactly as clear cut as most people want it to make it seem. What do people go and do where there is an advantage? Like, do you have data in terms of like, from a retirement standpoint, are there specific structures that they should actually look at where the math seems to be a little bit more in their favor?
Well, IRAs are much better because you can pick your investment options, right? So if like that alone, if you can pick your investment options, you can pick lower cost stuff. Now, if you have low cost stuff in your 401k, it's basically the same as an IRA. That's one piece of it. The other thing is like, with the 401k, like, you're putting that money in over time, and like, because you can't pick the investment options, that's a piece of it that's a little annoying. The other thing people can do is like, if you manage it well in a brokerage account, like, I don't know if people know this, but for example, and a single individual, you can pull out $40,000 a year. If you have no other income, tax rate is 0, right? And then if you have like, even with the standard deduction, it's like 50 grand a year and tax rate is 0 on capital gains. If you have a couple, you can pull out 100 grand a year, and assuming you have no other income, tax rate is 0. So like think about that. Like a brokerage account that's well managed, you can be pulling out 100K a year with no tax. So in that case, like a 401k would be even worse, right? So like that's kind of the process I go through. I'm like looking at this and I'm saying like, does this make the most sense for people? Yes or no? And so that really depends, right? In certain cases, it can also make sense. Like for example, if you're in a high tax state now and you know you're going to be in a low tax state in retirement, it does make sense to probably max because you're going to be avoiding those in a pre-tax retirement account because you're going to be avoiding those high taxes now and then paying the low taxes later. So that's kind of there's different ways to think about it though.
So you can pull out of a brokerage account $40,000, $50,000 as an individual as long as you have 0 income without paying any taxes on it?
Yep, that is a true statement. As long as you have no other income, your only income is your capital gains. Let's say you have $1 million portfolio, and let's say it's paying you 5% a year to make the math. That's 50 grand, right? So it's paying you 50 grand a year in income. Tax rate is 0. You have no other income though. If you have any other labor income or anything else, then you're gonna have to start paying taxes on it. But like tax rate is 0. So you're like, why do you need a 401k when you can put into a brokerage account? And if you just grow it big enough, like getting that yield, and then you just don't pay tax on it. Like that's the current law. Of course, the law could change, but that's the current law. So
yeah, it's fascinating. One of the things that is definitely a theme of these conversations is just like these rules are applicable to everybody, whether you're a billionaire or literally, you're on unemployment, right? Every single person, these rules are available. It's just a difference of knowledge and then also the ability to execute some of these strategies. But that's something that, once people know about it, they can go execute it themselves, obviously check with an accountant, et cetera.